Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. The Transparency Task Force is a certified social enterprise. We have a formal mission. Our mission is to promote reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. So our overall reason for existence, our raison d'etre, is about getting the financial industry to behave the way it really ought to. That takes our work into all sorts of interesting nooks and crannies. We're particularly spending a huge amount of time at the moment on trying to deal with and overcome regulatory failure. We're spending a lot of time on investment scams in particular, a lot of time trying to support people who've been scammed, and a lot of time at the moment in particular dealing with potential amendments to the Financial Services and Markets Bill. I should mention that there are three things that we, the Transparency Task Force, want to happen in relation to the Financial Services and Markets Bill. The first is that we believe the Financial Conduct Authority's immunity from civil liability should be removed. We want that because we believe the lack of effective challenge of the FCA is making it unduly unaccountable. And we don't think that's healthy. We don't think it's good for the FCA or for the ecosystem that regulates. The second thing that we want is the introduction of a duty of care, which would give people who've been harmed by the financial sector a much better chance of getting relatively inexpensive and quick redress from organisations that have somehow harmed it. And the third thing we want, not an original idea, we've nicked this one from Australia, we want there to be a heavy-duty oversight body scrutinising the regulators and making them more accountable. The Australians have absorbed that idea into their system. They did that post the Hayne Commission, or the Royal Commission into malpractice in the financial sector. I'm going to attempt to show you a short clip from last week's Question Time. I don't know about you, but I find Question Time, the programme, very, very intriguing. And it just happens that a piece came up in it last week to do with fraud. And I want to play that bit to you. It's just a few minutes, but it really does make several points that are either directly or indirectly relevant to the conversation that we are going to be having today. I'll pause as each point is made so I can kind of elaborate and share with you my thinking on the particular matter mentioned. The MP you're going to be seeing speaking is Andrew Bowie. He's a Conservative MP. By the way, the Transparency Task Force is not in any way politically aligned. We are completely agnostic politically. I'm not making a party political point here at all. He just happens to be a Conservative MP making a few points that I think I could and should comment on. Okay, so the main reason I wanted to share that clip is because I personally think that the way that crime figures are often reported is without the fraud bit. I don't quite know how that happened. I really don't quite know how that happened. At Portsmouth University, there's a very good academic department that focuses on crime and fraud and these sorts of things. And I remember the people there telling me one day that it's a huge problem that the figures around fraud are not properly included in the crime stats. There's that phrase, isn't there, that you cannot manage what you do not measure. And if for some reason, if for any reason, fraud is not being properly accounted for in the numbers and the way that police report fraud stats, then surely that's going to have some kind of an effect. Just before we go to Anthony Stansfield, Paul Cardier's put his hand up. Paul, there's a few people tonight who aren't regulars to TTF meetings. Could you please just very briefly introduce yourself and then very briefly make your point, Paul? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, Paul Cartier, former foreign exchange trader for many of the world's largest banks for 27 years, two-time whistleblower, and have the scars to show for that. Since 2015, work as a litigant, providing litigation support services and expertise for various law firms across the world. So, yeah, so quite a bit of experience here. But I just wanted to point out that, ironically, the person on the panel that pointed out, oh no, you're ignoring fraud, is Howard Davis, chair of RBS, the bank that destroyed 16,000 UK SMEs via GRG and all kinds of sinister conduct, including fraud. And I just, the irony is, I just thought it was worth pointing out.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much indeed. We're now going to be hearing from Anthony Stansfeld. Anthony's a frequent speaker in the world of TETF and the various meetings that we run. I personally find Anthony's evidence and testimony to be rather compelling because of the nature of the various roles he's had over the years. So, Anthony, thank you very, very much indeed for being here. Can we please show our appreciation for Anthony setting aside some time to present and prepare for this session? Let's say thank you, Anthony, first of all, and then over to you, sir, to share with us what you'd like to. Thank you.
Well, Andy, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me all right.
We can.
The question, why is the UK so poor at tackling fraud? Well, the answer is very simple. Nobody investigates it. It's as simple as that. In the US and Australia, there have been major inquiries into the cover-up of fraud and the investigation of fraud. In this country, I'm afraid we've done nothing. Less than 1% of the police budget goes towards fraud, and less than 1% of fraud is ever investigated. In money terms, probably less than 0.001% of fraud is ever investigated. There are four major sort of government areas in which fraud should be dealt with: the police, the regulatory authorities, the courts, and the government and civil service themselves. None of them appear to do their jobs properly, and I'll go through them one by one. Firstly, the police. There is very little expertise whatsoever to deal with fraud. They're financially remarkably illiterate. When Thames Valley took on the massive HBOS fraud, and I say massive, it was small compared to what was going on elsewhere, but it was a fraud about 850 million out of a single bank, HBOS in Reading. The police force had to employ 40 or 50 outside accountants to come in and go through the documentation. It took 3 years and it cost £7 million to do it. That money was never recovered by Thames Valley Police. The Financial Conduct Authority eventually fined Lloyd 65 million, reduced to 45 million for cooperating with the inquiry. Well, they certainly didn't cooperate with Thames Valley Police. And none of that money came back to the police to pay for the inquiry, for the investigation. And so the one lesson learnt by police forces is it's far too expensive to take on a very large fraud, especially a banking fraud. And some police forces seem to have an absolute desire not to investigate fraud. And I will mention that the City of London Police, the Met, and Avon and Somerset Police, where a huge number of frauds took place through Bristol. I'm going to be a little bit cynical. There are far too many funny handshakes between senior police officers and those they should be investigating in the banks and accountancy companies. And I slightly joke about it, but you only had to look at that recent programme about Brinks Mat, and the major player in that was invited to join a lodge, a Mason's Lodge, by fairly senior police officers. And I think far too much of that goes on. There's also a door of employment open for senior police officers when they leave in very organisations, the banks, accountancy companies, and legal practices, which they should have been investigating. There's a tremendous desire by police forces to pass off fraud cases as civil matters. No, they're not civil matters, they're criminal matters. Fraud is a criminal matter and the forging of documents is a criminal matter. But all the cases end up in civil courts. If they end up in a court, usually they're passed between different police forces, and action fraud which is a call centre in Glasgow, and precisely nothing is ever done. The principle is to pass the buck as fast as you can and not investigate it. Since the HBOS case was investigated some years ago, I think there's only been one major fraud that has gone through the courts. And that was a recent one where a man called Stephen David Jones defrauded a company of about £12 million. Well, the police had refused to investigate the case, and the CPS hadn't prosecuted. It had to be done privately in a criminal court, and the judge was absolutely scathing of both the police and the CPS. And I wonder if he's been interviewed in prison, because that man's name comes up in numerous cases, running into several hundred million, if not billions, that he has been one of the moving lights behind it. But I would strongly suspect he's never even been interviewed in prison. I'll just move on to the regulatory authorities. There are a quantity of regulatory authorities. It's between 16 and 20, I think, which actually cover in some way or another fraud, but I'll deal with the major ones. Firstly, the National Crime Agency. Though it's not a part of the police, in reality it is a part of policing, but kept separate. Its very small fraud department is financially sponsored by Lloyds Bank, a bank whose name comes up frequently in the major fraud allegations. Over 420 case files of forged documentation that were used to bring down companies and individuals were given to the NCA nearly 3 years ago. They cover billions of pounds, those cases. Most of them are very clear that fraud and forgery have been used. The documents are forged. The Treasury Select Committee 2.5 years ago asked the NCA to investigate. Nothing here to investigate, they said. They eventually admitted they would have a look at 12 cases, and I think they were very carefully selected to be the least important cases. There is a revolving door of employment between the NCA and those they should be investigating. It's not as though they haven't been well briefed. I briefed both the director, then Lynn Owens, and her number 2 on what was going on, and again, absolutely nothing was done about it. Her number 2, Graham Bigger, runs the NCA. Other senior members of the NCA have come directly from those institutions and companies the NCA should be investigating. I believe the NCA itself should be investigated to find out whether there has been serious malfeasance in public office. It certainly looks like it to me. Now I'd like to talk about the FCA. The FCA has been involved in a cover-up of major banking fraud for a long time. The Sally Marston Turnbull report was a detailed paper on banking fraud in Lloyds, and it was covered up for 3 years by the FCA. It was not made public. When it did become public, it was made public by one of the people that Thames Valley Police had sent to jail for fraud, and he released it. The FCA allowed the author, Sally Marston, to be sacked without any or very minimal compensation by Lloyds. Lloyds said she was mentally unstable, the allegations she made were unsubstantiated, and her report was unauthorized. All those 3 things were deliberate lies. I actually sat with the chairman of Lloyds, the chief operating officer, and their chief lawyer, where I was lied to, and we have the minutes of that meeting. It required Lord Hollick and myself to practically corner the chairman, Lord Blackwell, to get her compensation. She certainly wasn't mentally unstable. All the things she said were well substantiated, and it was authorized. I had the correspondence between her and the head of audit and risk of Lloyds. To say it was unauthorized was a very clear lie. Anyway, the FCA gave her absolutely no support whatsoever. It should have been right behind her, and they then did nothing with the report that they actually had. Another report is the Atwood report into what went on in Lloyds. I don't know what's in that report. It has never been released. It's been kept very carefully under covers, but I get the impression it was pretty good dynamite. I personally briefed the director of the FCA, which was Andrew Bailey, so he certainly can't say he didn't know about it. He now runs the Bank of England. Like the National Crime Agency, there's a revolving door of employment between the FCA and those they should be investigating. One of the extraordinary investigations or reports was the one to look into what went on and had gone on after the HBOS case and how Lloyds had dealt with it and whether Lloyds were up to it. It's the Dame Linda Dobbs report or investigation. This should have been an investigation carried out by the FCA, but they subcontracted it to Lloyds to do an investigation of themselves. It has been going now for nearly 6 years. No report has been produced, and all the people who are defrauded by it, by what went on in Lloyds and HBOS, most of them have not received compensation. And I find that absolutely unacceptable. One of the things that the FCA should have got onto are non-disclosure agreements. Those that were compensated after the HBOS court case only got compensated if they'd signed non-disclosure agreements. And Sally Masterton had to sign one as well. Why should you sign a non-disclosure agreement as a condition to get the money back a bank has stolen from you? That surely is totally unacceptable. The City of London Police. I think the main reason for its existence was to keep an eye on what was going on in the city and deal with fraud. They've now abrogated that responsibility. They're financially sponsored by Lloyds Bank. Other than attend major city functions and go to large Guildhall dinners, I can't really see the point of the City of London Police. It has some of the most highly paid police officers in the country working for it. And it does not deal with fraud in any way today. The Serious Fraud Office. I have a little bit of sympathy for the Serious Fraud Office. It's far too small and it's very badly financed. It only takes on a very few cases. They're carefully selected, and it usually fails to win its court cases. The 850 million HBOS case, the Serious Fraud Office had turned it down, as had 2 other police forces, before Thames Valley picked it up and ran with it and got the prosecutions. The Bank of England itself, under it, it has the Prudential Regulatory Authority, which is meant to look into these things, but I fear it really rarely does. Its main fraud interest seems to be to cover up fraud allegations that might damage a major bank, especially if it is a major shareholder of that bank itself, which it has been in the case of RBS and Lloyds. And as I said before, Andrew Bailey now runs the Bank of England in the same way as he ran the FCA, in my view. There are other outside government organisations like the Solicitors Regulatory Authority and RICS, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. I'm afraid they seem more interested in protecting their own people than actually holding them to account. And there are so many instances of this that are well documented. The court system. Why is it that fraud is practically always taken as a civil matter? As I said before, it is not a civil matter, it is a criminal matter. And it goes through, today, every time it goes through a civil court, if it ever gets to a court. And certain judges seem to sit on these cases. I mean, there's one case, I'll mention it, of Dr. Shada Araki. No less than 7 judges have sat on her case now. It's now gone to another sort of judge, and I won't go into that. But what is quite clear that is she is being taken to the cleaners through the civil courts, and it's gone on for far too long. It isn't her who should be. It is the people who are taking her through the civil courts who should be held up in a criminal court. No police investigation has gone on into that whatsoever, and it is an utter disgrace. The judges who sit on these civil courts are usually part-time judges. They spend 11 months of the year, probably, working in their normal jobs, and that is for the accountancy and legal practices in banks that seem to be most involved in frauds. To put it politely, the way that some of these civil judges deal with these cases positively stinks. And it does require proper investigation into what looks, I'm afraid, like corruption in some of our civil courts. And there are papers now being written on this, so I think it is going to come out with the names. Lastly, the government and civil service. I think the government has been really well briefed on this, as have, I have to say, the opposition parties. I briefed 2 prime ministers on this. I think too many MPs and ministers are looking for their next jobs. Certain ministers come up in the government's cover-up really with regularity. I'd be very interested to see what jobs they go to after the next general election. Whenever I briefed a minister, and I did it quite frequently as the Police and Crime Commissioner for Thames Valley, there'd always be a civil servant present. Immediately I left the room, I knew I was being briefed against by the civil servant. Don't worry about this minister, we got it well underhand. Anthony Stansel's exaggerating the problem, don't worry about it. And absolutely nothing would get done about it. The very fast turnover of Home Office ministers has not helped. What is extraordinary, we have two ministers who deal really with this sort of area. You have the police minister, but he doesn't deal with fraud. It comes under the security minister. I can't remember how many we've had in the last 7 years. I think it's about 5. How can a minister, when they're only for a short time, get a grip of a very complicated thing? They don't, is the answer. They're led by their civil servants. I think I'll end now. It's a very fast run through of why fraud is not investigated. It's basically because people don't do their jobs properly, and many are conflicted and I believe compromised. I've not got into how this can be sorted out. However, I don't believe it is that complicated or difficult, and maybe, Andy, you can have that as another discussion at another time, what can be done about it. It just requires, to sort it out, it requires the political support and will to do so. And I'm not holding my breath that anything is going to be done. It doesn't look like it at the moment. Andy, thank you very much. That's enough from me.
Anthony, thank you very much indeed, not just from me, from everybody here. You've managed to squeeze into just a few minutes a remarkable level of insight and analysis of the problem as you see it. You've been very clear, you've been very compelling. I personally find it impossible to listen to you, Anthony, without coming away with a huge sense of frustration and concern about how things have allowed to get so bad. Can we all show our appreciation to Anthony for this session just now, and then we'll throw it open to comments and questions. So if there's anything you're itching to come in with in response to what Anthony said, please come in now. If there is, just raise your hand, either digitally or otherwise. Paul Carney is first up the mark. He often is. Paul, to you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I can only echo pretty much everything that Anthony said, and with regard to the Sally Masterson case, yeah, the FCA did hang her out to dry, and were aware of everything that went on there. And when I escalated my disclosures to the FCA in early 2015, in a recorded interview, the FCA confirmed that they were concerned by the abuse of me as a whistleblower, and that this was a pattern they were seeing from Lloyds. So I'm absolutely convinced they were referring to Sally's case, because Sally was a victim certainly prior to me. And then it begs the question that I was contacted by somebody out the blue 2 years ago asking, saying they were working for the Dame Linda Dobbs inquiry, and they were seeking to track down somebody that worked in the Lloyds Group Security and Fraud Department. Would I have a call? I had a call, and it turns out that the person they were looking for was a guy by the name of Andy Horsley. And the only trace they could find of him online was in my tweets, because he was the guy that Lloyds assigned to investigate my disclosures as a whistleblower in late 2014. And yet at the time, Lloyds, because of obviously Dame Linda Dobbs has but one scope, and that is the Lloyds investigation of H. Ross Reading and obviously the abuse of Sally as well. It's quite clear that at the time they knew Horsley had produced all of this nonsense, or was involved in that nonsense that saw the concealment and cover-up and the destruction of a whistleblower. And yet he was tasked after that with investigating my disclosures, and produced exactly what he clearly produced first time around. So, and the FCA was aware of all of this and did nothing. And there's been I've got it on a recorded interview that they gave me a copy of, and at no time did they take any action against Lloyds for this pattern of abuse of whistleblowers.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. By the way, when Paul's speaking later, he'll mention the new piece of work about whistleblowing that the Department for Business has just got underway recently. So Paul, please remember to come back to that later. We're going to hear from Richard Loxton, then Pauline Creasy, then Nigel Harper, before we then go to Oliver Lodge. If I could please ask Richard, Pauline, Nigel to be as brief as possible. I'm very keen that we make sure we hear from Peter Grant before he needs to disappear. Peter Grant MP, I should say, rather, before he needs to disappear at 7 o'clock. So, Richard, as succinctly as possible to you, sir. Thank you.
I was a victim of property-related fraud and all the stuff about Bristol, Avon and Bristol, Somerset Police, possible links with the dodgy handshake brigade. Absolutely, I have very specific information at a small scale. So whereas that information presented was at the macro level, I have information at the micro level. And very briefly, I spent most of my working life working in document management systems, which is incredibly boring, but I was used to dealing with large scale problems. I have investigated fraud, internal fraud, as in my own capacity. So I know how difficult it is to prove fraud. And based on previous conversations, yes, I can see that trying to go after the FCA directors is impossible because they're so protected. But I do believe if you focus on the people who provide the technical support, who have lesser protection, that is a possible route forward. And that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Thank you very much indeed for giving us that update. That's very good of you, Richard. Thank you. We're going to hear from Pauline Creasy, who's taking herself off mute as we speak, and she's just put her camera on. Hi, Pauline. And then we'll hear from Nigel Harper. Then we'll be going to Peter Grant MP, not Oliver, to Peter Grant. Pauline.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to say in response to what Sir Anthony had said, I was a victim along with 250 other people where we had our money stolen by a regulated payments institution who took our money when we were moving house from one country to another and stole the entire money. It turned out, just very in brief, that they'd been running a Ponzi scheme for 12 years and they'd been regulated during that time. And that Ponzi scheme was being operated through their bank accounts at Barclays Bank London. Amazingly, that no red flags were raised or they were ignored or battered away, whichever. And the FCA regulated them for 8 years under the Payment Service Regulations 2009 and 2017. Just wanted to add to Sir Anthony's point, and he may be interested in this possibly, in that we, the victims, actually had to do the investigation ourselves in order to get anything done about it. We were successful in 4 years. It took 4 years, and as Andy knows and some other people of this group know, because I was on a few times talking about it, it was just pure grit. It was absolutely horrible. Many hours we had to go to represent ourselves in court, go up against insolvency practitioners who were taking a lot of the remaining monies in fees, but delivering very little for the victims. We had to go up and get the judge's support. We weren't lawyers, but we had to learn the law. We had to really understand the payment service regulations. We did our own investigation, which meant going to several different countries. We managed to get the Portuguese police and Spanish police on board, and Portuguese police in particular, their fraud police, were actually, I think, instrumental in helping us get the FCA's attention, that they really had to do something to help us and do an investigation and get Barclays basically to give us back our money. Because I think they were, to put it bluntly, embarrassed, or they didn't like the fact that we brought in international partners. And that was a big factor, I think, in getting attention. We also got a campaign going with various MPs. And I don't want to say too much about that, but in order not to take up too much time. But my point is this: it was very frustrating trying to talk to the various government departments. Absolutely right. The police just say, look, this has nothing to do with us. We would love to help you. I went to Kent Police. I went to Action Fraud. That Kent Police did try to do something. This is where I was living. Surrey Police were actually appointed by the NCA because Action Fraud approved it for an investigation. Surrey said, we can't do this. It's too big. We don't have the budget, etc., etc. We don't have the skills. All in all, everywhere we went, Home Office, etc., it was just very, very frustrating. We had to do the work. Portuguese police decided to register it as a criminal offence, and they started putting it through their criminal courts. And I think that's when we began to get the FCA's attention that we were not going away. We then presented a lot of overwhelming evidence from employees, etc., ex-employees and customers who actually admitted that they were money laundering through this organization. We did get our money, but nobody got prosecuted, unfortunately, despite there being quite damning evidence. I won't go into, I know why that was. It was because their lawyers said, if you come after us, we're going to say, why did the FCA not go after the founder director who had actually passed away by that time and say to him, you're not obeying the regulations, you're committing fraud, you're running a Ponzi scheme. And that seemed to be their get out, astonishing as it sounds. So nobody went to prison. And in fact, two of the directors who are members of the family of the founder director are actually still working in financial services organizations, dealing with consumer money in very high level positions. It's just shocking. What I wanted to say to Sir Anthony and to the other speakers, in my view, we do need something like an FBI who specializes in fraud. And these will be people that work in it year in, year out, and don't keep disappearing through revolving doors if we can manage to do that. Because it became very clear to me that the FCA, and I don't want to sound totally disrespectful to the FCA, they did actually do very work and spend many hundreds of thousands of hours on this case over 4 years. But it became clear to us at the very beginning that they didn't really understand their own regulations that they were actually regulating. And I and one of my colleagues, victim colleagues, had to spend quite a lot of time talking to them about where we saw the violations in the regulations by both the firm and the bank, which is quite astonishing, really, that victims have to do that. And I think there does need to be something like an FBI style where you can get experts who know the forensics, who know how fraudsters operate, and keep those skills alive, because you're never going to get it from any government department or any quasi-government organization like the FCA. The FCA are primarily lawyers, and they're there to look out for the industry. They're not there really to look out for the public, I'm sorry to say. So that's it. I just wanted to put my 2 cents in.
Thank you very much indeed, Pauline. As always, very clear, very compelling, very potent. And thank goodness that you and your colleagues managed to fight back and achieve the result you did. It's truly staggering what you managed to do. Thank you, Pauline. I put into the chat a note about Ian Davis, rest in peace. I won't spend time explaining now, but what made me think about Ian was when Pauline spoke about trying to investigate ourselves. When you read the notes I've put in the chat about Ian Davis, you'll understand why. And it's such a shame that he ended up taking his life, in a sense of, I don't really know what the words really, a sense of profound hopelessness and frustration. I think it probably sums it up. Professor Nigel Harper, to you as briefly as you can, please, and then we're going to go to Peter Grant, MP. Thank you, Nigel.
Good evening, everybody. I had the privilege of working for HMRC for a period of 6 years prior to my retirement. And my role was to police the bank's accounts, their activities for large business services at HMRC on the Aldwych. I reported a chairman of a bank directly to Andrew Bailey, who I wanted to be put in prison because he was aiding and abetting money launderers. And the reason I know that is because I wrote an 86-page report referring specifically to one of their clients that was called the Mafia. Now, I found that name rather striking, because why would you call your bank client a mafia? Anyway, that was one issue. The other issues that I've had to deal with are the fictitious accounting practices that Lloyds and RBS use. Their accounts are a work of fiction, and I know that to be true because I have actually examined their accounts. I've faced the accountants, Deloitte's and various other ones, in Edinburgh and challenged them to provide me with the right information. Unfortunately, the banks, Lloyds and RBS, could not provide me with the information that I required to identify those loans that they have written off for their loan impairment provisioning procedures. This, I think, is a big fraud. Another issue that I came across in Lloyds in particular, which was rather amusing, because we came across an email chain from one Lloyds Bank banker to an independent valuer of a ship. Now, this is on tanker leasing defeasance. scheme. The Lloyds Bank man wrote to his independent valuer asking him to value the ship at X pounds. The valuer, to his credit, wrote back and questioned this. He said, "Are you sure?" And the banker wrote back and said, "Yes, that is the value I want placing on this depreciation for this tanker." The cost to the revenue was £100 million. It was blatant fraud. I then went to the head of HMRC and told them I wanted these people prosecuting and I wanted them put in prison. Unfortunately, a phone call from the Chancellor came through and it was squashed. And this is the problem. The Chancellor controls the puppets all around the city. And until the Chancellors are qualified bankers who actually know what they're doing, along with Andrew Bailey, I have to say, who used to be a very good friend of mine. We used to speak on Christmas Day to each other. And I had respect for him originally, but I have absolutely no respect for him at all now. And he knows it. So there we go. We have a problem in the city. HMRC knows where all the skeletons are buried, believe me. There's over 1 million pages of evidence in the upper tier tribunal on one case that I was working on, which was the film scheme for which obviously was attractive to people like David Beckham and all the others, which of course, luckily we won that one. But the fraud that HMRC sees is the first stop. They identify it first, but they do not have the budget to deal with it. And I would request that, certainly from the MP present tonight, that we start looking at this problem seriously. Because if you look at HMRC, you will find where it all starts. You will see it, it's there, it's blatantly obvious to anybody who knows. And I actually managed to get 3 senior directors from a major US bank who were all earning £2.5 million a year, plus bonuses, plus cars, etc., etc., banged up for ostensible VAT fraud linked to mortgage fraud. These people are out of control. They think they're above the law, and believe you me, they get away with it.
Yeah, Professor Harper, thank you very much indeed for very, very powerful testimony from you tonight. Thank you very much. We're going to hear from Peter Grant MP. Peter's been very, very supportive of the work of the Transparency Task Force and the all-party parliamentary group that we are involved with. I haven't got time to sort of go into the reasons why now, but I just want to sort of put on record that the Transparency Task Force and the all-party parliamentary group are both very, very grateful for the support of Peter Grant MP. Peter, I know you've got a bit of a cold, so you may not be able to speak too clearly, but we're very much looking forward to what you wish to say, Peter. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy, and thanks for the opportunity to speak at this. I suppose it's one of these things where I don't want to say I'm very pleased to be speaking. I'm angry that I'm having to speak to you guys again today, and I know a lot of you are angry that we're still talking about things that have been known about for a long time and haven't been acted on or prevented quickly, if at all. Very briefly, I'm the Member of Parliament for Glenrothes in Fife. I'm part of the Finance and Treasury team for the SNP at Westminster. I was previously the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and I don't have that official role now. I'm still part of the finance team. I'm also now the Deputy Chief Whip at Westminster. I became involved in a lot of the work of the task force, as I think most MPs have done, through constituency cases. I've had a number of people who have been involved in a lot of the cases that many of you, but the names of them will be very familiar to many of you. I'll mention a few of them later on. As Andy said, first of all, I do have a cold, so if I have to stop to have a coughing fit, please excuse me. I'm keeping an eye on a screen in the corner of my office because we're expecting votes sometime within the next 10 or 15 minutes. Hopefully, I'll have time to finish my remarks. If you hear a bell going behind me, it doesn't mean the place is burning down. It just means I have to dash off to vote. Once I'm called to vote, we're likely to be voting for about an hour, so it's unlikely I'll be able to join the call again. Originally, I was invited to speak on behalf of the Public Accounts Committee because we hoped that by this time we would have published our report into progress in combating fraud. That report hasn't been published yet, and the rules of the House mean that I'm not allowed to give any indication at all as to what it includes. But the National Audit Office report, which we relied on quite heavily in our sort of work, has been published as a matter of public record. The evidence session that we took from a number of enforcement agencies a month or two ago was live, and that information, that the transcript and the recording are publicly available, and I will be sort of referring to some of that. I should make it clear that unless I explicitly say otherwise, like, any opinions I express here are my own, they're not necessarily the opinions of the Public Accounts Committee. Inevitably, I'll be commenting on things that either the current or previous governments have done or haven't been done or haven't done. So it will be political in that sense, but this is not the time for me to be making political points. And the final sort of introductory comment is a lot of the facts and figures that I'll be quoting tend to be England-based or England and Wales-based, because that's where the Public Accounts Committee is focused. I've no reason to believe that the figures would be significantly more encouraging if we looked at fraud statistics and clear-up rates in Scotland. So I'm not giving the English figures because I think they're any worse than Scotland. I'll give them because they're the ones that are most likely to apply to you. And obviously a lot of the enforcement agencies, such as Companies House and the Financial Conduct Authority, have remit that covers the whole, certainly the whole of Great Britain, and in some cases Northern Ireland as well. I'm going to look particularly at fraud against individuals and small businesses. And we should remember that very often a fraud against a small business is directly a fraud against one or two individuals, because it's very often the one or two individuals who set up and run the business who are affected. So that the psychological impacts, the impacts on people's lives of a fraud against a small limited company or a small sort of partnership can be exactly the same as they are if it's a fraud against an individual consumer. And I think if you want one answer to the question, why is the UK so poor at tackling it? Anthony touched on it already. It's because there isn't the political will to really take it seriously and to really invest a lot of political time and capital and public money into prevention, investigation, prosecution, and ultimately sanctions. For example, if you look how long it takes to get any kind of restorative action for victims of fraud, we've heard from a few cases already, that's if they ever get any compensation, let alone how long it takes to put the measures in place to make sure that a similar fraud is harder to commit in the future. These things take so long that it's hard to believe that there is a genuine driving political will at the back of it. And that has been the case through 6, 7, 8, 9 prime ministers and umpteen chancellors in my experience. So it's not just that one or two individuals just now don't give it enough priority. I'm not saying that ministers don't care about it. I'm not saying that governments don't care about it, MPs don't care about it, but there's always something more important, something more urgent, possibly something that's more of a vote winner or something that'll grab the headlines better. Just to give one example, I did a account on Thursday of last week, and by that point, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, had mentioned the word fraud twice in Parliament since he became Prime Minister last year. One was in his statements on the changes to the Northern Ireland Protocol, where he was talking about potentially having additional checks on cross-border trade if there was a suspicion of fraud. The other time was in direct answer to a direct question at Prime Minister's Questions, where somebody asked him about a specific case where a constituent had been defrauded, and he basically couldn't answer that without using the word fraud. That's only twice that he's mentioned the word fraud in the Chamber and the House of Commons. He's mentioned the word immigration 23 times, small boats or small boat crossings 12 times since December 2022. Now, clearly there isn't a direct mathematical formula that you can use to link how often a politician says something and how much they're actually giving attention to it, in the way you can prove that E equals MC squared and so on. But my concern is if the Prime Minister's not talking about it in the Chamber and the House of Commons, it's unlikely he's talking about it very much at Cabinet. And if the Prime Minister's not talking about it at Cabinet, then the Cabinet's attention is going to be elsewhere. And if you look at some of the numbers in fraud, a lot of these are taken from either the NAO report or from the evidence session that the Public Accounts Committee had. You begin to see the impact of that lack of political will at the top, because I think that partly feeds its way through to a lack of enthusiasm, a lack of almost belief among some of the regulators that fraud is their responsibility and their problem. In the year to June 2022, that's estimated was 3.8 million frauds and attempted frauds against individuals in England and Wales. In the same year, 4,816 of those fraud cases led to somebody being charged or called into a criminal court. That's about 0.1%. 41% of all crimes against individuals are fraud. And as has been pointed out, less than 1% of all police officers in the UK are involved in their investigation. There's a massive mismatch between the preponderance of fraud as a major part of the crime landscape in the UK and the amount of resources that the police dedicate to it. Part of that is because there are specialist organisations that are supposed to be doing the job, but I think it should be possible to train up police officers to be able to take on a lot of the frauds that have a big impact on the victims, but which are never going to be big enough for the FCA or the City of London Police to think that they should be following them up. And the government's last estimate, this is in 2015-16, so it's at 2015-16 prices, excuse me. They reckoned that fraud against individuals cost about £4.7 billion. To put that into context, that's almost exactly the value of the entire milk production industry in the United Kingdom. So if you think about it, every time you go and pay £2 or £3 for a carton of milk, imagine that somebody who's taking that money out of your pocket. That's the scale of fraud that we have just now. As far as fraud against businesses is concerned, the government almost literally have no idea. They've got lots of estimates that come out from different departments, but they're so wide-ranging, the government effectively admit that they haven't even begun to put a reliable figure on how much fraud against businesses is first of all costing those businesses and then ultimately costing all of us. Because if an honest business gets defrauded, the only two ways that they can deal with that are to shut down and put people out of work, or to increase the prices, which eventually leads to everybody paying more for banking services or insurance services and so on. And that's before we look at the legacy, as Andy's already referred to, one very sad case that we've experienced recently, the legacy of broken families, lives destroyed, people's mental health destroyed, and as we're seeing far too often, people deciding that they cannot go on living because of the impact that fraud has had on them. It's a public health problem as well as purely an economic problem. Some academic studies suggest the total cost of fraud to the United Kingdom is about £150 billion per year. You know, if you thought that some other types of activity were costing the taxpayer £150 billion a year, you can bet your life that it would be getting a lot more attention from government ministers and from government departments. All too often, fraud is seen as something we don't talk about. People talk about white-collar crime and blue-collar crime. If you look at the likely sentence for somebody who commits a £10 million white-collar crime sitting at a computer screen, and the sentence of somebody steals £10 million from a bank or from the home of a wealthy person, the two crimes are treated very, very differently indeed. That means that fraud is a low-risk crime in today's Britain. If you're a criminal and your crime is going to be acquisitive crime, which is basically stealing in fancy words, nobody robs banks anymore. Most sensible criminals don't do burglaries anymore, except for very targeted attempts to burgle specific people who are known to have a lot of valuable goods in their properties. Why would anybody break into a house to steal money when fraud gives them a 90% chance or better of getting off with it scot-free? And even if you do get caught, what does it cost you? Before the last committee evidence session in December, I sat down and Googled the words fraudster jailed to see what came up. I found one person who they managed to catch before he could actually pull off his £30 million fraud. So he's attempted to steal £30 million, convicted of attempting to steal £30 million. He got less than 2.5 years in jail. A woman with a previous conviction for fraud, as a result of which she was banned from being a company director for 10 years, did what everybody else does to Companies House rules, ignored it completely, set up another number of bogus companies, set up a fraudulent identity for herself in order to do that, used the bogus ID in the bogus companies to initiate a further fraud that pulled in £200,000 before she was caught. For the second offence of fraud and for all of the other offences added together, she was jailed for 3 years. That is not a deterrent. Even if you know you're going to get caught, a 2 or 3 year sentence for a second offence is not going to put off the determined fraudster. And I used to do a lot of work in internal audit and risk management, a lot of you will be familiar that a standard thing that you do is you multiply the likelihood of something bad happening with what you think it will cost you. So that something that is unlikely to happen, but costs a lot or causes a lot of damage, you'll still focus on it as a risk. Something that doesn't cost very much, but is a very high risk, is something else that you focus on. Imagine that you're a budding fraudster and you sit down and do your analysis and you find that the chance of getting caught is well under 10%, and for some kinds of fraud, it's less than 1%. By the time you factor that in, the expected value of a prison sentence for fraud is a few weeks or a few months at most. We can talk about it as a maximum sentence of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. If you don't get caught, the sentence is nothing. And for about 95% of fraudsters, they know they're not going to get caught. And if the record of detecting and prosecuting and punishing fraudsters is poor, the record in preventing it is even worse. I've mentioned before, and Andy's familiar with some of the organisations I've been looking into on behalf of constituents. As I'm not speaking under parliamentary privilege, I need to say that although, for example, an unnecessarily and inexplicably large and complex company structure is very popular with fraudsters and extremely popular with money launderers, we can't just assume that a company sets itself up in this way is necessarily up to no good. It's perfectly possible that outfits such as Blackmore Bond, Safe Hand Plans Limited, Phillips Trust Corporation, that these companies have perfectly sound and legitimate and valid reasons for making the companies so opaque. And if anybody listening knows what those reasons are in relation to those three companies, please tell me, because for the life of me, I can't understand a legitimate reason why they had to be set up that way. We still don't have any checks on who's setting up registered companies and on whether the company or even its directors really exist. The Transparency Campaigner, Graham Barrow, who's well worth a follow on Twitter if you don't already, he's been unveiling some frightening statistics about the number of Chinese-based individuals registering literally thousands of companies in the UK. We don't know yet that these are being used for fraud, but the Chinese government, who run all these things in China, haven't just decided they want to invest in the UK because they like us. Graham recently published a list of 55 companies, all registered by somebody with the same surname in the space of 3 days. I think his record is 2,000 companies registered to addresses in China in 24 hours. Companies House have neither the power yet nor the resources to look at any company registration to confirm whether or not it's valid. That's bad enough, but in the most recent annual report, one of the main highlights, one of the main achievements that they're proud of is the burgeoning size of the company's register. The number of companies being registered is seen as a measure of success by Companies House, without any acknowledgement whatsoever that an unknown but probably significant number of these new companies are only being set up as a way of committing fraud. Although they don't have the powers to stop those abuses, they do have the powers to make life uncomfortable enough for dodgy directors that it'll deter some of them, possibly a lot of them. But those powers are not used often enough. For example, one of the warning signs that a group of companies is going bad is if they stop telling you what they're doing. It's an offence for against the directors and the company to fail to file their accounts on time, or to fail to file a confirmation statement in time, to update records of who the directors are, who the major shareholders are. I've seen examples where a group of associated companies had 30 or 40 separate notices of compulsory liquidation put in place and then lifted for failing to file these requirements. And for a lot of companies that are officially small companies, but a small company can do a lot of damage, the information they have to file is pretty useless anyway. It tells you next to nothing. And yet companies get away with failing to file that information over and over and over again. And if you do it for a lot of different companies, Companies House might keep an eye on each company. They don't look at the directors and say how often the same director is doing it over and over again with different companies. It's a bit like, I make the comparison that you get somebody that runs up 150 penalty points on their driving license, and they don't lose their license because all of the offences were committed when they were driving a different car. Companies House don't have I don't think they've got the resources. I'm not convinced they've got the technology. They certainly don't seem to have the willpower to do what I've done, what a lot of others have done, and start to draw lines between lists of company directors and find out where these webs are. One thing that I found out that I've already shared with Andy, I mentioned the Safe Hands Plans and the Phillips Corporation Trust. One was funeral plans, one was will writing services that people lost a lot of money on. The same individual is heavily involved as a director, a former director, or both. For example, Companies House didn't do that. So they weren't in a position to look at what happened with one company and wonder if it was happening with the next. And that, of course, assumes that the directors give the correct name and the correct date of birth. It assumes that the directors actually exist. Companies House don't check that. One trail that I followed from a Blackmore bond company led very quickly to a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old that were registered as officers of a limited liability partnership. My good friend and colleague, Alison Thewlis MP, assures me that she's seen a Companies House document where an unborn fetus was registered as a company director. The date of birth given to the director was later than the date on which the company was registered, and nobody in Companies House or nobody anywhere else had the job of identifying that that was quite clearly, possibly just a genuine mistake, but quite possibly a company that was being set up for no purpose other than to commit fraud. I know that earlier on Pauline mentioned, she didn't mention the name of the company. I know exactly which company she was talking about because I had constituents that lost money with them as well. She referred to them having run a Ponzi scheme. When I was looking into the collapse of Blackmore Bond, one of the annual reports that one of their group of companies did actually file with Companies House said something like trading conditions were difficult and they would only be able to pay out the, I don't know if they referred to it as a dividend or interest on previous money that had been lent to them by innocent members of the public. They would only be able to pay it out if they were able to get more money in from new investors or new lenders. That's a Ponzi scheme. This company basically sent a document to the Companies House saying, we are a Ponzi scheme. Companies House put it on their website and did nothing more about it. A lot of the companies, and I know that Andy will be familiar with a lot of them, when you look at the accounts that have been filed, okay, I'm an accountant. You don't need to be an accountant to know that there's something extremely suspicious about the accounts being filled by a lot of these companies. Nobody in Companies House looks at the numbers before they publish them because it's not their job to investigate. It's their job simply to publish. It's their job to take everything on trust, despite the fact that we know that it's probably a very, very small proportion of company directors who are genuinely crooked. But the ones who are genuinely crooked are able to do a huge amount of damage, first of all, to the economy of the United Kingdom, to the reputation of the United Kingdom. We are now probably the best place in the world to set up a fraud. It's one business in which, if anything, Brexit has made life easier rather than making life more difficult. And I've got a concern that some of the changes are going through in the Financial Services Markets Bill might actually makes a fraud easier to carry out rather than more difficult. Some of the reforms that we thought were going to force the regulators to be more accountable to the victims of fraud may well be twisted around so that the regulators can be brought to heel by either by the dodgy operators themselves or by people acting on their behalf. Some of whom, as we've seen sometimes, can become very influential in government, either directly or indirectly. So if we have a position where government ministers can effectively pull back a regulator from carrying on an investigation, to me that becomes political or governmental interference in law enforcement of a kind that is extremely dangerous. And there have been attempts or threatened attempts to put that kind of provision into the Financial Services and Markets Bill before. So those are some of my thoughts. Again, like I think a lot of the other speakers on the meeting, I could speak for a long, long time. I'm looking at the screen that tells me that the Minister is now summing up in the debate. So the bell is likely to go very, very quickly. So apologies if I don't have time to stay on for very many more questions. I'm quite happy for Andy to share my email address with everybody on the call. And if there's any questions you want to raise with me afterwards, please don't hesitate to do so. Thank you.
Peter, once again, you've added an immense amount of value to this this conversation, having the perspective of a parliamentarian such as yourself with a real interest in driving the kind of changes that are needed to stamp out these pandemic levels of fraud is just priceless to us. Peter, thank you very much. I'm sure everybody else would also like to show their appreciation for the session you just covered tonight. And good luck with all the reforms you're trying to make happen in Parliament. So allow me to share my screen. The reason I'm sharing it is because the topic of Companies House has come up many, many times in various meetings that the Transparency Task Force has run. And I want to show a clip that's actually from a comedy program called The Outlaws. It's pretty self-explanatory, but basically there's a bunch of roguey type individuals who are basically up to no good, and they're talking about doing a crime, doing a bit of fraud, and what they're basically saying is that they want to set up a dodgy company. Tell you what, while I find that and get that on the screen, why don't we go to Lord Sandhurst now? So, Lord Sandhurst, thank you very much indeed for being with us. This is your first time at one of our events, if I remember rightly. We'd love to hear what you have to say, Lord Sandhurst. Thank you very much. Thank you.
What you're going to get is effectively a very quick overview of the findings of the House of Lords committee, select committee, which sat last year on the Fraud Act and online fraud. We sat from February through to November. We heard evidence virtually weekly for a couple of hours or so from a wide range of witnesses and a lot of documentary evidence. And then we produced a fairly lengthy report. The overview, and I hope I'm not repeating what other people have said, is that losses through fraud over the past year total a staggering £4 billion. That was in 2021, sorry, because we were reporting in 22. But that's, I shouldn't think the figures have changed much. It was 41% of all crime against individuals, which picks up what somebody else said earlier. 80% of reported frauds, and I emphasize reported, are cyber-enabled. As we all know, online banking and shopping have become mainstream. Online dating has become widely adopted, and online messaging platforms and social media are in everyday use. We found that only 1% of law enforcement is focused on tackling economic crime, and I think one of our other participants has made that point today. Digital investigation remains outside the capacity of mainstream policing. Counter-fraud policy is spread across what we've called a complicated map. There's a plethora of agencies and bodies and a vacuum of responsibility. The different stakeholders often fail to put adequate systems in place, and businesses have been allowed to enable and to facilitate fraud. We found and concluded in our report that we simply cannot arrest our way out of or through this challenge. We've got to take another approach. That's not to say we shouldn't make arrests and prosecute, but that is not going to stop what's going on. The telecom sector, we found, must do much more to tackle phishing emails and smishing texts, and must take steps to prevent fraudsters from making spoof phone calls. So that was our first point. Next, web hosting providers must prevent fraudsters from registering fraudulent website domains. So that's a responsibility for them. The tech center generally must prevent fraudsters using online advertising and social media platforms to reel in consumers and do much more to verify identity on online dating platforms. We've all heard of romance frauds, which are very humiliating and can take someone's complete savings. Until fraud-enabling industries fear significant financial, legal, and reputational risk, we were quite clear they will not act as they should. This was a cross-party committee. We were unanimous on all these points. We concluded that we need statutory duties to prevent fraud, which businesses, if the fraud is established, must show they took reasonable steps to prevent. So if you deal with some business on the internet and you're scammed, then this will put a burden on whoever accepted the original advertisement to say they took reasonable steps to verify that it was a bona fide business. Do you get the flavor of it? We said that the private sector, therefore, must be encouraged to combat fraud through facing the threat of corporate criminal liability, or at least regulatory action. There should be a safe harbor for sharing of data for preventing fraud. Until fraud-enabling industries fear financial, legal, and reputational risk, they will not act as they should. So we need a statutory duty to prevent fraud, and the burden will then be on the business to show that, in fact, they had taken reasonable steps to prevent it. And we take the view that there's scope in current financial legislation going through Parliament to bolt on such obligations to the extent they're not already there. There is something in the online safety bill which will address one aspect of this, but that is not enough on its own. So it's a good thing, but we need other things as well, which will have to go into other bills. So we took the view that fraud has got to be a top priority. £4 billion is far too much, and it should be included within the strategic policing requirement. We determined that there should be a cabinet subcommittee which has a clear mandate to tackle fraud, and it should be established and chaired by and be accountable to the Security Minister, President Tom Tugendhat MP. The government, we said, must introduce a new corporate criminal offence of failure to prevent fraud, and that should apply across all sectors. The online safety bill, as I've said, contains important measures to prevent fraudulent content and scam advertising and to hold tech companies to account. And we're keen that that doesn't get lost in the debate on this important bill. Finally, the government should oversee the introduction of a single centrally funded consumer awareness campaign in partnership in industry. And if I haven't said it already, we took the view there should be a safe harbor whereby banks and others can exchange information on a confidential basis, but put on a much wider, more formal basis than happens at the moment. Those were our overviews. I think one other thing which I may have missed out is advanced payment frauds. We also said that where an unusual amount of money for an account is being, for a particular client, is being used to make a payment, the banks should have algorithms and so on in place to pick this up and to put a temporary freeze on while they check with the client that this is indeed a transaction the client wants to make. It shouldn't just go through. And half an hour's delay or an hour's delay or even half a day's delay in a housing transaction or something is not going to be a problem. So we put together a package of measures. We don't think that you can just arrest your way out of it, but we do think that the whole organization of law enforcement has got to look at this properly, but that's quite a detailed topic and not suitable for this discussion tonight. All right, so that's the overview, and I hope it gives you something to think about. And what I would say is that those who are really interested should spend an afternoon or so reading our report, because then you'll get all the flesh, and I've just given you the bones. All right?
Lord Sandhurst, much more than all right. That was terrific. You set out a range of possibilities there for the kinds of reforms that would clearly make a massive difference. It seems to me that what you're saying is there's no silver bullet here. There needs to be a multiplicity of approaches, each dealing with things at a tactical level, but the aggregate would be a strategic transformation.
Yes. And what we hope we've done is given government and the regulatory authorities a route map. Said these are the stations at which you've got to stop. This is what's got to be addressed. I mean,
So
one piece of evidence which had impressed us was that a few years ago, I think it was Google, were fined very large sum of money because they'd been allowing or not stopping advertisements for unregulated medicines. This is in the United States, and someone clamped down on them. I can't remember, it was 50 million or 500 million, but a huge fine. So there's reputational damage, and of course it hits in the pocket.
Mm.
And surprise, surprise, they found a way of preventing such advertisements thereafter. And that's the model we want to see here.
Precisely, that clearly makes a great deal of sense. You've been wonderful with your time tonight, Lord Sanders. Thank you so much. We'll be circulating the committee's report,
Yeah.
so that everybody does have access to it. And if you are seriously interested in this topic, it clearly makes a great deal of sense to invest time in studying that. Lord Sandhurst, thank you. I'm sure everybody else will also want to join me in thanking you for your time tonight. I found the short clip I wanted to share. So this is from the comedy series The Outlaws. You may have seen this before, because I have shown it before, but either way, I hope you enjoy it. There we go. All right. So when the shoddy state of affairs that is Company's House makes its way into mainstream comedy, you know, there's something pretty serious going on. Oliver, you've been wonderfully patient with me. You can probably tell we're rather behind schedule, but the content just been so rich. I didn't want to stop any of our speakers. Oliver, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Please introduce yourself and dive into your material. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy, and that's absolutely fine. It has been incredibly interesting. I am going to share some slides to talk through, if that's okay. And in doing so, I have to say I don't have any amusing videos, so I'm awfully sorry about that. But hopefully I can still be interesting. Here we go. And what I'll do today is provide a slightly different perspective from what we've heard so far on the issue of fraud, which is the audit perspective. But don't let me lose you before I've started. For those that don't know about the National Audit Office, we are the government's independent spending watchdog. We support the Public Accounts Committee, and I'll talk a little bit about the report that Peter referred to earlier. But before I do, let me just commend the Lords Committee report that Lord Stansfield talked about, Sandhurst talked about. It's an excellent piece of work, and it gets right into some of the policy challenges that need to be tackled in order to make progress in this area. What I'm going to do is take a different view. I'm going to talk about the implementation of government policy, because one thing that it is worth knowing about the National Audit Office, we do not and we cannot question prevailing government policy. What we do is look at the implementation of that policy and whether it is being done effectively. So we audit the accounts of every central government body, and we produce about 60 reports a year on various areas of public spending. And in the past, we've done work on both government's efforts to protect itself from fraud, but also on its efforts to protect us, citizens, individuals, businesses, from fraud. And I'll touch on both. So first, the work we've done on government's efforts to protect itself. We actually have a report publishing on this week on Thursday. I can't say too much about it because it is under embargo. But what I will say is reflecting on some of our experience of looking at government spending over the pandemic. And I think we all know that the response to the pandemic greatly increased the risk of fraud and error for the government. In responding to a public health emergency, government had to spend a lot more money. It had to support new groups of people, and it had to quickly introduce new supply chains. All of that meant it prioritized speed over control and increased risk as a result. Now, based on the information in the published accounts, over the 2 years of the pandemic, the government lost about £21 billion of taxpayers' money to fraudsters. That's a huge number. Comparing it to the 2 years prior to the pandemic, we're talking about 5.5 billion. And that doesn't include the amount lost through tax evasion, which was referenced earlier, that would have otherwise come to HMRC, probably another 10 billion there. So massive amounts of money. What this week's report will do is set out the extent to which government understands the risks it is facing in terms of protecting our money from fraudsters, and whether it has the capability to effectively manage those risks. So take a look at that when it comes out on the 30th. But what I will talk about now is our work looking at government's response to fraud against the citizen and businesses. And we looked at this back in 2017. We produced a landscape review of online fraud. We didn't conclude on value for money at that time, but what we wanted to do was set out the scale of the challenge and how fit government was to address that challenge. We had a fairly bleak conclusion. We concluded that fraud was being overlooked. The Home Office needed to do a lot more, and we made a number of recommendations to push them in the right direction. So last year, we decided to take a look at how they were doing in responding to that report 5 years down the line. And the first thing we found, I won't dwell on this because I think Peter covered it well and it will be familiar to all of us, is that in those 5 years, the threat from fraud had grown, it had changed, the response hadn't. So we've got, a powerful figure there, and that's just focusing on recorded instances of fraud, not attempted, much bigger numbers. And you can see the rise there of 50% between 2017 and 2022. Correspondingly below, the fall in the number of recorded fraud cases that result in a charge or summons. Peter's talked about the proportion of police resources dedicated to pursuing fraud. What's also worrying is the likelihood of people experiencing fraud reporting it to the police has also fallen in that period. So it is really concerning. And against that backdrop, what we wanted to do was look at the Home Office's leadership of the government's response to this challenge. And we didn't look at the detailed operational response, but rather whether the Home Office had set itself up to succeed in how it was leading its partners and industry. And to do that, we used a framework that we developed from looking at other complex cross-government challenges like net zero to see if we could learn from those approaches and superimpose them onto the fraud landscape. And you can see here there are 4 broad areas that we wanted to examine the Home Office through. And I'll briefly summarize what we found in each of those areas. So firstly, setting direction. It's very important to be clear about what you're seeking to achieve when you're dealing with something as complex and fast-moving as this. And over the years, the government has published a number of strategies that relate to fraud, cybersecurity, anti-corruption, serious organised crime, economic crime. None of them have specifically focused on fraud as a type of crime. But more significantly, even where they have included measurable actions to try and address the threat of fraud, such as in the economic crime plan, these have all been based on inputs or outputs. There's been very little focus on outcomes, nothing setting out clearly what it is the government is seeking to achieve through its investment in this threat. And that matters. And he said in his opening remarks, what get measures gets done. I completely believe that. It's the basis for strong accountability. It's also the basis for an approach that can learn and adapt, which is necessary. There are signs of progress on this front. In April 21, the government committed to a new fraud action plan. In March last year, it committed to develop a fraud strategy focused on the problem. They were hoping to publish that before the end of last year. I'll come back to that in a moment. So we hope that they're moving in the right direction on setting direction. On working with others, the Home Office clearly can't do this on its own. It needs to work with a large number of organisations in order to respond effectively. Other government departments, industry, policing, the public. But what we found when we looked at the breadth of those relationships was, firstly, a really weak understanding of the level of resources dedicated to this problem. The Home Office gives out grants, it agrees funding settlements, and it understands and monitors those. What it doesn't understand is the full extent of resources these other organisations or industries are deploying. And that makes it hard to judge whether the partners have the resources they need to do what the Home Office expects them to do, and also, harking back to my previous point, to measure whether it's making a difference. And the level of influence the Home Office has over these partners varies a lot. Just in the industry space, it's got fairly long-standing relationships with the banking and telecommunication sectors. From what I've heard today, questions about how effective they are and a lot of reliance on voluntary charters. But the tech sector, very, very less mature in its understanding of relationships. And it's at the very early stages of building the international relationships necessary to truly understand and manage that dimension of the threat. And then finally, in relation to its work with the public, we looked at this in some depth in 2017. And what we found coming back to it was there was very limited progress. So Action Fraud, which various people have mentioned, work to reform that service and make it more effective, still ongoing. Still multiple cross-cutting communication campaigns with a lack of coherence to them that are not landing with the public. And the work to try and better coordinate these is in its very early stages, despite us raising this back in 2017. So moving on to monitoring, learning and improving now. I think the first thing to say is the sophisticated and evolving nature of the fraud threat means it's very challenging to develop an accurate, up-to-date picture of that. But we found that though the Home Office has an awful lot of data pulled in from all sorts of agencies and it presents it and collates it regularly, there are still some big gaps. Most notably, the lack of accurate and up-to-date estimates of what fraud actually costs the economy. Peter went into some detail on this, but it's concerning that the most recent figure for the cost of fraud to the economy was from 2018, in 2015-16 prices, and even then not covering the cost to businesses. And what this means is the Home Office cannot have a good understanding of what is effective in tackling fraud if it doesn't know what the impact of fraud is, nor the impact of what its interventions are. And that's a real serious limitation and one we're pressing them to improve on. And then finally, the kind of pillar that sits across the bottom, taking a whole system approach. This is really vital in tackling something as complex and that crosses as many boundaries as this does, both departmental and international. I think it's positive that there has been a lot more focus from within the Home Office on fraud in the last couple of years. The development of the Fraud Action Plan, the development of a new fraud strategy, relaunching the Joint Fraud Task Force. More effort is going into it, but that still doesn't amount to the type of holistic whole system approach that we would want to see. There is no integrated plan that sets out how the work of these different organisations and agencies aligns with an overall vision. There's lots of activity, but little coherence. And because of the limitations in the data and the understanding, it's hard to see what impact that is having or to prioritise effort where it's needed. So this was where we ended up in our report. This was our conclusion. It was reasonably damning in respect of the level of response the Home Office was leading. But we were positive about the potential that a new strategy would have to re-energise government's response. We made a number of recommendations about the development and the implementation of that strategy, and encouragingly, all of those were welcomed and accepted by the Home Office when we published the report and through the session of the Committee of Public Accounts that followed. So, and as I've been listening to everybody talk today, I've been questioning my final slide and its, guarded optimism. But I've chosen the picture of this light at the end of the tunnel quite carefully. It's a very, very long tunnel and a very dark tunnel. And I think we are waiting with bated breath to see this new strategy, a long-term strategy that focused on the problem and responds to the recommendations that we set out. It was announced back in March last year. It was promised by the end of last year. We still haven't seen it. and we're still waiting. I think this tunnel is long. Political will has been mentioned a number of times. I think that's absolutely required. I think the other thing that's required is a level of ambition that's been lacking to date. The Home Office is going to have to lead government down that tunnel very quickly, because it's still being built at the other end as fraudsters adapt and evolve their approach. So if they are going to make a difference, they're going to need to move quickly. They're going to need sustained commitment and really, really strong leadership. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Oliver, that was fantastic. We really have been blessed. I'm sure absolutely everybody would agree to this. We really have been blessed with outstanding presentations from everybody tonight. It's been first class. Oliver, thank you very, very much indeed. We'll have a bit of a Q&A discussion session a bit later on, but in the meantime, myself and everybody else here would like to thank you for taking time to prepare and present your session, Oliver. That was very, very good. I love the honesty and the balanced reporting in the report that you and your colleagues produced. You know, from the conversation we had, we thought it was great that you had this sort of progress begins with realism mindset. You didn't want to gloss over things. You didn't want to put an elastoplast over the wounds. You actually wanted to dive in to really understand what was going on. And the honesty and the integrity of your report is absolutely first class. Superb work from yourself and your colleagues. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. We're going to go straight now to Mike Haley. Mike, please take yourself off mute. Please take a moment to introduce yourself, and then as succinctly as you can, get your message across, sir. Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Andy, for inviting me. The first time I've encountered the Transparency Task Force. I'm really pleased to be here. So my name is Mike Haley, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of CIFAS. CIFAS is a not-for-profit fraud prevention community. We have 660 organisations who share data and intelligence. I guess, you know, there's a very broad range of individuals with different concerns on the call. And I think that shows the breadth of the fraud problems. And so kind of the part of the fraud problem we seek to deal with is volume fraud. This is volume fraud against institutions. Some of the institutions you called out have been both the site and the recipient of fraud. So if you look at a bank, there's been clearly issues where the fraud has occurred within the bank, but it's also the target of fraud. So we tend to deal with things like identity fraud, where there's both an individual victim and also an institution which could be defrauded. I've also been the chair of the Joint Fraud Task Force, and I sit on the Joint Fraud Task Force still, and I was a director at the short-lived National Fraud Authority about a decade ago, before it was abolished, and I've been investigating and leading fraud departments about 30 years. I've given evidence in the last year to the Public Accounts Committee, the House of Lords Committee, Baroness Morgan's and Lord Sandhurst Committee, and also on the FS, the Financial Services Marketing Bill, for expert evidence. So I want to, and I think going quite late, Andy, is that there's not much more to add, but what I've got is 5 quick things about why is the UK so poor at tackling fraud in my view. 5 glimpses of a better future. I'm really with Oliver. Did I want to say there's light at the end of the tunnel? Glimpses of a better future, but then 5 things that we need to prevent fraud. 5 more things we need to do. So some of this is a repeat. So the 5 things: the absence. Why are we so poor? The absence of a fraud strategy for 10 years or more. There's no strategic approach to tackling fraud. I think it's been a complete lost decade since the National Fraud Authority published its last fraud strategy. And the National Fraud Authority was a victim of the cuts that came in under austerity. And clearly, in my view, it was a short-term saving of several £1 million, which has now led to, literally hundreds of millions of pounds of extra fraud. So the absence of a strategy for 10 years to deal with fraud is my first one. Secondly, and we all know this, is a low risk and high reward crime. Insufficient police resource and attention by policing. Repeated for the 3rd time, 41% of recorded crime, 1% of police resources. It's still not a priority in the strategic policing requirement, but it gets a better call out in part of organised crime at the moment. And police are just not set up for investigating fraud. Police were set up many, many years ago around constabularies, which are around the geographical area. In the days when the burglar that burgled your house probably lived in the same area, you're the victim, there's the perpetrator. Fraud has dispersed numbers of victims, and the perpetrators could be anywhere else in the country or even overseas. So policing is just not set up in a way to tackle fraud. Thirdly, and I'd call this out, Oliver, very much, lack of understanding of the scale and nature and harm of fraud. It is a wide set of harms and practices. We're talking about, in the same breath, volume fraud against plastic cards, identity fraud, insurance fraud, authorized payment fraud scams, corporate fraud, to the types of unfortunate frauds that many people on this call have suffered. All of that, from individual frauds, frauds against institutions, and frauds by institutions, are all covered in, it's a very broad landscape. It's like, in my view, saying, how do we deal with crime? Because fraud needs to be understood as a series of different complex activities. And there has not been any credible and single version of how much fraud costs since the annual fraud indicator was stopped when they abolished the National Fraud Authority. So we don't actually know. We've been bandying around numbers. Is it 5 billion for individuals? Is it 100 billion for businesses? How much for small businesses? Sometimes those estimates are coming from organizations who have got a vested interest in stirring up, or selling a product themselves. So then it becomes incredible. It certainly is many, many billions of pounds, though. Fifthly, lack of political will. We have seen, even recently, in the last week, the political debate over crime is about antisocial behaviour. It takes precedence and visible crimes, even though they are reducing. As one report into policing fraud, and there's been many over the last few years, the Mackey report, I think it was, stated that if it doesn't bang, bleed or shout, it can be ignored. And I think that is ignored by police politicians, with one or two notable examples like Mr. Grant earlier. So there, from my view, they're the 5 things why we're bad at tackling fraud. 5 glimpses, the light at the end of the tunnel. I think, one, we're having this debate. Fraud is now a more salient issue, increasingly recognised for the harm it does cause to individuals, organisations, and the UK PLC. Only this week, last week rather, I heard Tom Tugendhat speak at a Stop Scams event, who reflects that it's a national security threat. Why is it under his remit rather than the police minister? It's a national security threat. That's the scale of the amount of fraud. So we've had all those reports. We've got it is more salient. People are talking about it. So there's a glimpse of, we can start creating more action on the basis of recognition and understanding. Secondly, the forthcoming Economic Crime Plan 2. I'm not sure I'm meant to give you any details on that because it's coming out, I think, in a few days. But that has fraud as one of its 3 areas of focus. Far more in it about fraud than Economic Crime Plan 1. And that will call out the need for the public to have confidence in how fraud is tackled, because it is absolutely lacking. The fraud strategy is coming, Oliver. But again, another month or so. It's nearly over a year since we've said, where's that fraud strategy? But it is coming. So there is some light. Thirdly, new capabilities are coming online. We have the Public Sector Fraud Authority that was launched. Recognition after Lord Agnew said, my goodness, we're not very good in government dealing with fraud. We can talk about Action Fraud and National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, but there is significant money going in to actually improve both the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau and Action Fraud. So I think we are bringing new capabilities online. Fourthly, we now at last have an engaged minister at the Joint Fraud Task Force, and Tom Tugendhat. I've sat with 5 different ministers, real mix of whether they're really interested or not, but Tom gets it. And fifth, I think, would say that we've seen legal reforms coming through. We aren't going to see reforms of Companies House. We've been arguing about it, examples, but reforms of Companies House are coming in. We see the Economic Crime and Transparency Bill coming through, which will help to be able to share more information. We've seen unexplained wealth orders come in, and we've seen the online harm bill. So I think we are seeing legal reforms coming in to help us fight it. It's not enough though. The 5 things I'll end on. What more do we need to prevent fraud? First of all, and you wouldn't be surprised for me to say this, because I head the largest data sharing and intelligence community around fraud, is to say that we need more data sharing between organizations, between the public and private sector, and between the and with law enforcement. We're fighting fraud with one hand behind our back. And it came out of the House of Lords report, which Lord Sanders called out. We need a safe harbour to share data to prevent fraud. Then fraud attacks can be dealt with at source. So I think that will make a big impact. Secondly, let's not dodge this. We need to increase the capacity and capability of police. The numbers of police investigating fraud, their skills, their training, their career progression. There needs to be a rebalancing of risk and reward for fraudsters, because now they're unlikely to get the collar felt, they're unlikely to get prosecuted, they're unlikely to go to jail. So we definitely, I'm actually a bit fed up when people say we can't arrest our way out of this issue. Well, we've got to start arresting more people, literally have to. Thirdly, a lot of the reform, we've been around this circle before. 2006, Lord Goldsmith conducted a fraud review. Out of there, we did have a lot of the new capabilities put in place, but it was before the digital age. We need a new fraud review to look at how do we deal with digital fraud. Fourthly, the failure to prevent offence, which I'm a big supporter of, has to bring around cultural change. It has to have teeth. And lastly, a single authority to coordinate across this vast amount of different actors who have got an interest in fraud. I think that we've got to an issue where when it's everyone's responsibility, it's no one's responsibility to tackle fraud. We need someone who's accountable, an organizational individual. And Pauline, I love it, an FBI for fraud. When you look at America, you see people like Bernie Madoff arrested in handcuffs and in an orange jacket, an orange jumpsuit. For lots of hardened criminals don't mind going to prison because it's part of what they think, part of what they balance up when I'm talking about robbers. But fraudsters don't want to. You don't want to be a white collar crime and go to jail. It actually would be a deterrent. So I think that an FBI for fraud would be something I'd really be supportive of, so that we really put the heat on white collar criminals. So try to rush through there, but that's my view, Andy.
Mike, thank you very much indeed, sir, for sharing your views so clearly and so succinctly. It's much appreciated. The content really has been very, very rich tonight. I've probably underestimated how much time we needed to set aside for this topic. And it feels to me we need to revisit this topic in maybe 6 months or so time and keep a close eye on how things have developed. Let's thank Mike, please, everybody. That's very good of you to spend your evening with us, Mike. Appreciate it very, very much. I made a point in the chat, by the way. We really do rate Tom Toogan, that MBE MP, very highly. He's engaged with us from pretty much the very beginning of the TTF story, and I've got a lot of faith in his ability to help turn things around. Mike, thank you very much indeed for mentioning him. We're going to go straight to Richard Hyde. Richard, as succinctly as you can, and then we'll wrap up with Paul Carlier, hopefully for about 8 o'clock. So, Richard, please take a moment to introduce yourself and share with us your key thoughts about this rather complex, knotty, challenging, tricky problem. Thanks, Richard. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I'm Richard Hyde. I'm a senior researcher at the Social Market Foundation think tank, where we're a cross-party and non-party think tank, so we don't affiliate left or right to either Conservative or Labour. And we've been sort of dipping in and out of the fraud issue for the last, since 2019, really. We sort of first dipped our toe in, and then last year published a paper, and on the back of that, I've engaged with various organisations, policymakers, police, and so on the issue of fraud. A lot of what we've written has been sort of touched upon here already, so I'll try not to repeat any of that and focus my remarks on some, I guess, back of the envelope type calculations we did about if you were going to sort of match policing resource to the scale of fraud, what that would kind of look like in terms of police numbers and so on. And it starts really from the insight that one analysis from the late 2010s suggests that if you could increase the detection rate fraud by 1%, you get a 14% reduction in frauds overall. So, the limited evidence that there is that's been done rigorously suggests that there is, building on what Mike's just said, there is you can make inroads into this if with the police doing more, arresting more, investigating more, and arresting more criminals. And we just looked at the numbers, and it's been said that less than 1% of the police workforce works on economic crime, completely disproportionate to the scale of the economic crime, in particular the fraud that's going on. And we reckon that if you were to match sort of proportionately the number of police in England and Wales to the scale of the crime, if you're using the police recorded crime data, or the action fraud data, you'd be looking at 30,000 police and support staff being redirected to work onto economic crime issues, and particularly fraud. If you were to allocate police resourcing in terms of people in proportion to the scale of fraud as it's counted by the Crime Survey of England and Wales, you'd have to direct about 80,000 police and police support staff around England and Wales towards dealing with fraud. And obviously at the moment there's about 1,700. So that just gives you a sense of the huge deficits that there is there. But again, bearing in mind the fact that if you can, the limited evidence does exist that suggests if you can increase the detection rate, then you can make inroads into fraud. And to be honest, again, we did some number crunching, again, back of the envelope stuff, but even if you redirected 30,000 police, say, and their staff to dealing with fraud, and even if they were only as productive in terms of investigation and arrests as the City of London police, we reckon that you could there'd be a 17-fold increase in the number of arrests for fraud in a year, which is about 93,000 extra frauds resulting in arrests each year. So that's bearing in mind that's without actually increasing the productivity of the police. So if you manage to increase the productivity of the police, you get a double bang for your buck for moving those police across. And the other sort of interesting point to note, we felt thinking about redistributing police numbers was actually that, and I don't know how many people sort of clocked onto this fact, but England and Wales, we're an under-policed society when you compare us to a lot of other sort of advanced industrial societies. So in that context, we argue, actually, you probably don't want to just shift policing resource from its focus on, the range of sort of real world and physical crimes that it's currently investigating and trying to deal with, but actually you'd want to add those tens of thousands of police and specialist support staff on top of the current numbers, and perhaps even take the policing numbers in the UK up to something closer to the EU EEA average. So just to give a flavour of some of the numbers we crunched, we looked at, so in 2020, in England and Wales, there were 218 police officers per 100,000 people in the population of England and Wales. The EU average was there were 352 police officers per 100,000 people. And in Italy, there's an astonishing 453 police officers per 100,000 people in Italy. And even if you took a sort of an Anglosphere country like Australia, they've got they have around 274 police officers per 100,000 people in Australia. So, you know, even if you were sort of saying, well, you know, the proper comparators are Anglosphere countries, well, certainly Australia, the one we could find the data for, still has a per 100,000 of the population, a lot more police officers than we do. So, you know, we argued it wouldn't be unusual, it wouldn't be strange for policing in England and Wales to increase its numbers beyond the current planned uplift of 20,000. So, you know, it wouldn't be unusual. We wouldn't stand out in any particular way if we did recruit 30,000 extra officers and support and specialist support staff, and then focus them all on economic crime and fraud in particular. But I won't. I'll put a link to our paper that we did in the chat in case everybody wants to dive into some of the charts and some of the other things we said. We set out a whole sort of structural reform plan as well, because, you know, we're in it. We're conscious that, for example, you can't just add numbers. You've got to have the police, as the point has been made several times this evening. You've got to have the police that are trained, understand the problem, and are trained to investigate it properly as well. But I shall stop there as we're 3 minutes to 8. So,
Richard, thank you so much for covering your ground so succinctly. Much appreciated. Once again, folks, can I please invite you to put your hands together and show our appreciation for the speakers. We definitely will be revisiting this topic in maybe 3, 4, 5 months' time. I'll liaise with the speakers and see when it might make sense to have like a part 2 to this very intriguing conversation. We're going to go to Paul Carlier. Paul, within 5 minutes tops, please. So it's 1958. You got 5 minutes tops. Do the best succinct version of what you want to cover now, please, Paul. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, so basically I'm literally going to whiz through this. This was put together in about half an hour this afternoon when I got asked to speak. So basically the questions being asked tonight, this was a question that was asked on the 15th of March last year by the Justice Committee, and this was put to the director of the CPS. And basically, why do we not see more of these cases being prosecuted? The CPS didn't have the answer. They were going to come back, but literally a week later, I had some evidence that I presented as an attempt to answer the question. Now, I can't find my. There we go. So on 21st of February last year, I made a report to Action Fraud, and as you can see here, this is the automatic response that I got. This was on 21st of February, and as you can see, you get the response from Action Fraud. It's a no reply email address, so you can't communicate back. So they assure you that they're going to investigate or review my case or my report and get back to me within 28 days. This is a copy of the another fraud report that I made against a completely separate body the following day. So both reports were separate, and in both of them you only have this amount of space to make your report, and there is nowhere to put evidence. So in both of these reports I say I've got substantial evidence, you know, and I look forward to sharing with you further. So, and again, I got the same response to this one as well immediately from the Action Fraud team. Now, in both cases, I say, I told them that I had significant further evidence to prove my allegations, and I had to establish that because there is literally no means of uploading any information or evidence from making your report. So 28 days later, I get this. This is from the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, and again, from a no reply email address. And it says, we've reviewed your case, and on this occasion, based on the information available, it's not been possible to identify a line of inquiry which law enforcement organisation in the United Kingdom could pursue. They've not contacted me for my evidence or anything. They've not been in touch, despite me saying that in the report, but they clearly say that they have reviewed my case. Now, the very next day, I get an identical replica of that response in response to the other action fraud report that I'd made. It's literally a copy paste, and it's exactly 28 days after the initial report. And it says exactly the same thing, but no one's been in touch with me in this one either. Now, this is an extract from both of those things, and it says here that despite the decision, if you have the opportunity to update your report, if you have additional information about your crime, which you believe could change the assessment, please log into your account and submit that information. Well, there is nowhere in the action fraud dashboard. There's nowhere to put that information. And as I said before, this comes from an email address that is a no reply email address. There is literally nowhere for me to send my information. And what they're saying here is actually a lie. There is nowhere. You can't go to your account and update your information. So, and indeed, this is all that exists. It's a tick box. It says, what evidence do you have? So you just literally have to tick the box to tell them what type of evidence you have. And obviously I've said, I've got all this evidence, I'm happy to share it. That's all you can do. You can't actually share the information or evidence you have. So I dug deeper into my report, and lo and behold, here it shows that here it's a record. There's the confirmation email I got originally thanking me for my report and that they will review it. And this is the fulfillment email. Now look at this. It says there, timer, 28 day, right? What this meant, these are automatically generated fob-off responses. They are timed to be sent to you after 28 days of the report. They've not been looked at all. And this is far from a unique experience. Now, what I'm about to show is just a couple of slides. This is in respect to the Blackmore Bond fraud and Ponzi scheme. And if you're listening, Mr. Rathie, the Insolvency Service or City of London Police, it was a fraud and Ponzi scheme. You know it was. I've given you the evidence and you still refuse to engage. So this is actual statistics from City of London Police. This is the number of reports made to Action Fraud about Blackmore Bond. Now look, Blackmore Bond, the bottom one there, okay? 52 reports. The first one of which came in 2016, the year Blackmore Bond was launched, right? City of London Police had a report about Blackmore Bond the year it was launched before a penny was lost, okay? Now, so all these responses, what happened? Every person, this is an actual response from NFIB to one of the victims who reported Blackmore Bond to Action Fraud. And I've got a dozen of these, all identical, all sent in respect to all these different reports. And as you can see, it says the same thing. On this occasion, based on the information available, it's not been possible to identify a line of inquiry which a law enforcement organisation in the United Kingdom could pursue. Really? Let's look at that again, right? Just that one part. No lines of inquiry? Nonsense. Because when they sent this, the NFIB, they had evidence, they knew that Blackmore Bond directors Nunn and McCreesh have both been under investigation by the SFO, the Serious Fraud Office, since May 2017 for their role in the Capita Oak pension scam. They were paid 600 grand in commissions to induce people to invest in that scam, right? So that's not, we're not talking about, are they convicted? The NFIB is not talking about, enough evidence to pursue a conviction. It claims there's no line of inquiry. That's an absolute line of inquiry. And furthermore, Surge Financial have been under investigation by the SFO since 2019 for their role in the LCNF fraud. Surge Financial paid 40 million in that fraud to induce people to invest in LCNF. They were paid 6.5 million to induce people to invest in Blackmore Bond. How does those two not constitute lines of inquiry? This is on top of the 31 million that's missing from the money. Where did that go? And this ignores all of the evidence we've got to show that there were Ponzi transfers made from one Blackmore Bond vehicle, investment vehicle when it matured, into Blackmore Bond, but no money ever changed hands because the money was long gone. It's a Ponzi scheme. So you cannot make a report and it's not being looked at. So did the NFIB lie to Blackmore Bond victims when they said, or did they just send automated fob-off responses to these countless vulnerable victims, right? How can you possibly investigate or prosecute fraud when you don't investigate? This is not me making it up. This is all there. You make a report. No one's looking at it. Nobody is looking at your report. Nobody's looking at the evidence. and they're dishing out these timed responses. They are literally timed to come out. Now, if you look at my action fraud dashboard, it says in both of those cases, not reviewed. It actually says in the dashboard, not reviewed. Yet NFIB are sending out these timed automated responses. So no one's looking at it. That's why the answer to the question is no one's looking at it. And yes, I get that there's resource issues and everything else, but I've had this issue with the Ombudsman, the Financial Ombudsman Service, 4,000 people employed. Well, I'll tell you what, employ 10 people like me with all the experience and expertise on, say, 200 grand a year, and that's 300 people at the FOS who you employ with no experience, so you don't have to employ. And our output would be, we know what we're looking for, bang, there you go, right. Yeah, we know what to ask for, and we know where all the skeletons are buried and where all the gaps are. So I don't think that there's 30,000 police officers required. I think there's a much less number, but it needs to be specialised. And if you have to pay up for the expertise, then do so. But also, let's not forget, we all talk about the amount of money involved in fraud. Well, if the recovery, some of the recoveries was redirected, policing fraud becomes a self-financing process. So I'll leave it there, Andy. That wasn't quite 5 minutes on that.
No, that was superb, Paul. It always is, frankly. It always is. Paul, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure everybody else is wanted to join me on that. It's so frustrating. Ladies and gents, I have a plan, okay, a plan. There may well be some of you who want to share further thoughts. So here's an idea. I'll sort of formally wrap the session up in just a minute. We'll then have a sort of a 2, 3, 4, 5 minute break and come back at, say, 12 minutes past 8. If anybody wants to come back at 12 minutes past 8 and carry on the conversation, it'll be very informal. I'll lightly facilitate the sort of the chin wag amongst us. Please do, okay? I'll keep the camera rolling. We'll keep the recording going. So remember that. We're carrying on recording it. But just formally, I'll wrap the session up now, and then we'll carry on for those that may want to, because my instincts are telling me some of you may well want to say a few more things. What I want to do first of all, though, is of course to thank our speakers. It's been spectacularly high quality input tonight from Anthony Stansfeld, from Peter Grant MP, from Oliver Lodge, from Mike Haley, from Richard Hyde, from Lord Sandhurst, from Paul, who we just heard from now. I'm absolutely convinced that we, the Transparency Task Force, have got a part to play in bringing these issues to the surface in the way that we do. And I really do hope that this kind of evidence and this kind of testimony gets listened to. So thank you very much indeed, all the speakers. We'll formally wrap the session up there. If anybody wants to come back in roughly 3 minutes' time and carry on the conversation, please do. It'll be very informal, it'll be very relaxed. I'll lightly facilitate it. And if there's just 2 or 3 of you, that's fine by me. But I'm happy to sort of set aside more of my evening to accommodate that if you wish to. It's 9 minutes past 8 now. We'll carry on reconvening it in, say, 2 or 3 minutes' time if anybody wants to come back. If I'm on my own, I know that that's not the case. Thanks, folks. Thank you very much indeed. Brilliant session. And I'll be back in 2 or 3 minutes. If anybody else wants to join me, that's great by me. Thank you. Thank you very much. There's still some folks here. Amazing. This is a big topic, isn't it? I'm just going to sort of say something to Alexandra. Alexandra, edit out the last few minutes, obviously when I've been away from the desk, but just sort of spice it in from here. Thanks, Alex. Thanks very much. I can see we've got Richard Emery's hand up. Richard, please introduce yourself and share your thought. Thank you.
Hi. So what I do primarily is assist individuals who've been the victims of fraud to challenge their banks and take cases to the Ombudsman Service. But what I just wanted to touch on, first of all, can I commend Lord Sandhurst's report and Baroness Morgan's report? It's really important. There's a lot of really good stuff in there. There's also stuff that actually comes forward from the 2019 Treasury Select Committee report in terms of proposals to the banks to prevent fraud. And those proposals have not been ignored. They have actually been positively rejected by UK Finance. So I just wanted to point the finger in the recording. UK Finance have publicly said that certain things that have been proposed cannot be done on the basis of they are not allowed under the regulatory framework. And that statement is not true. So we have UK Finance, the representative body of the banks, blocking developments in fraud prevention because they don't want to do them. So I just wanted to put that on the record. totally pick
Richard, forgive me, Richard, before you move on, you're making a very powerful point. What is your guess as to what the motivation is for them to behave the way that they are?
Because the banks would need to invest in systems development and technology to be able to do it. And they are concerned about the way that customers will react. Specifically, I'm referring to delaying payments. So there is a specific proposal that was in the Treasury Select Committee report, is repeated in Lord Sandhurst and the recent Baroness Morgan report, which is to delay high value payments to new payees for 24 hours. And it's something which is being proposed. And I think the banks don't want to invest in the technology, in updating their systems to be able to do it. It would be a significant update to their systems. And I think they just don't want to invest the money in doing it, despite the clear and obvious value of doing so.
In your mind, Richard, if they were to do that, if they were to introduce this sort of delayed payments mechanism, would it be effective? Would it actually stop some people having their lives ruined by fraudsters and crooks?
If I look back at the last 5 years, I can point to several £1 million that would have been prevented by those delays.
So,
sorry, it's as simple as that.
So, which one do the banks prefer? The pain of having to pay for the systems to work the way they need to work, or the reputational damage, the consumer detriment, the inhumane experiences? I mean, just mind-boggling to me, Richard. Thank you so much for raising it. Thank you.
Well, the thing is that where we now link this to is, I know that TTF have been very clear that the new consumer duty is in an adequate response to what was meant to be a duty of care. Mm. But I draw attention to this, that within the new consumer duty, it actually says, as one of the cross-cutting rules, a firm must avoid causing foreseeable harm to retail customers. Foreseeable harm may be caused by both act and omission. So I'm looking at developing a paper probably next month to go to the major banks to say, by act, by omission, by not developing systems and processes that will prevent fraud, you are therefore causing foreseeable harm to retail customers. Yeah. And that's where I really want to take this over the next couple of months. So that's an area of development, but it is. There are a number of things that the banks could and should have been doing, which they've been on notice for 3 or 4 years, and have just chosen to not do it. So the banks are clearly failing. But UK Finance is arguing that I was in a conversation on Radio 4 Money Box with Paul Lewis, with a senior member of UK Finance's team, and I'd agreed in advance with Paul Lewis that if this person said what I thought they would say, I would not challenge it on the radio program because it would be unhelpful. But we both knew that she was going to make a statement that was not true. So, so UK Finance is another part of the problem. The other thing which I would say, just commenting on what was said about Action Fraud, I'm currently involved in a fraud case involving 180 victims, £10 million. We've got an active police investigation, but people who have reported to Action Fraud have been told there are no active lines of inquiry. So we've already got the police investigation, and people are still having their cases thrown out. So really, that's really the points: is the consumer duty, the Treasury Select Committee, and the Lord Sandhurst report. Do read them; they really are good. But we've got to push to get the actions that come out of those reports. Mm. And I say, for me, I mean, I just throw this out because I'd value. We've got a group of intelligent people sitting here who are obviously concerned about this. So let me just put this out there, right? 24-hour payment delay simply says, when you try to make a high value payment to a new payee, and I'm saying anything over £500, right? So saying anything over £500 to a new payee will not be released to the payee for a clear 24 hours after the payee has been created in your banking system. Now, people's reaction generally is that will be very inconvenient. So I always ask the question, when was the last time you made a payment of more than £500 to somebody that you had never made a payment to before and didn't have their details at least 24 hours before they needed the payment. And in 5 years of asking that question, I've only had one person who's come back with a really substantive response. And that response could easily be dealt with by a phone call to the bank to say, yes, I am authorizing this payment and I want it to go through now. But the reality, the biggest area where this impacts, and which is why I said I can identify millions of pounds that would have been saved, is my wife earlier today got an email to say she needed to update our TV license. I will tell you what will happen if she responds to that email. She will pay the £145 TV license. An hour later, she will get a phone call that purports to come from the bank to say you've been the victim of fraud. That is the fraudsters phoning up. They will tell her that her account details have been compromised and that she needs to move her money to a new safe account that the bank has created for her in order to protect her money. And if she falls victim to that, then she will transfer the money to a new payee immediately. She'll put the phone down and then she'll go, that was fraud, but the money's already gone. And I had one case a couple of years ago where the fraudsters managed to persuade somebody to make 14 payments of £20,000 in the space of 2 hours to 3 different new payees. And the banks didn't intervene, and simply a 24-hour delay on a high value payment to a new payee would prevent that type of fraud. It would have an enormous impact on account transfer fraud, because the principle of account transfer fraud is the fraudsters are going for speed of action.
Richard, thank you so much.
I'd be interested to hear what anybody else, how any of you wise and learning people, Paul's put his hand up, what you would say to that.
Thank you very much indeed. I think it seems eminently sensible to me. I propose we wrap up in about 10 minutes or so, depending on who wants to say what. Please raise your hand if you'd like to come in at this point, just either digitally or literally, and I'll see if I can see you. Paul Gregory, please go for it, Paul. Please take a moment to first of all introduce yourself, Paul, and then make your point. Thank you.
I do work with a parliamentary lobby group for representing small business on an unpaid basis and cover late payment, insolvency, etc. But basically, what you've said is absolutely correct. But there is a further aspect to this, is we are dealing with people who are entrenched in not doing anything, who have connections one with another, and we're getting the wrong people inside the regulators, etc. As Anthony Stansfeld pointed out, this is, unless you clear with ethical, competent people, nothing will happen. You have to get rid of all the funds that are compromised. And I don't know how that's going to be done.
Thank you very much, Paul, for such a forthright comment. Thank you. Who'd like to go next? Raise your hand. Shida, please take a moment to introduce yourself. Dr. Araki, or Shida, is the lady that was mentioned earlier by Anthony Stansfeld. Please take yourself off mute, Shida. I'm very pleased to have you with us tonight. Thank you for becoming a member. And off you go. Thank you.
My pleasure. Good evening, everyone. I just want to add to all this fraud. In my case and my husband's case, has been acknowledged by court, High Court judge. In his judgment, Robert Ham QC in 2017 said, I am willing to accept the bankruptcy order was based on a judgment which was obtained by fraud. I have provided 5 case law fraud on unresolved. And my opponent bring a barrister who sits as a judge in the same court, and he says to Your Honor, fraud on unresolved does not apply to the bankruptcy, without providing any authorities. And still in 2023, yesterday, I have had someone at my home, they want to renew the writs of possession to sell our family home for the cost of the proceeding, which I have got a ruling from the High Court in 2013 to say the bankruptcy order should have not been made on the basis of Insolvency Act 1986, Section 2821A. We are victim of the fraud, yet after 18 years, we are suffering from injustice. And so far, 4 insolvency practitioners have been defeated. 5 firms of the solicitor have been defeated. I have taken it up with 4 ministers at BEIS, and no one wants to look at this case. If anyone has got any suggestion that where do I have to go, I really appreciate.
Gina, thank you very much indeed. I can see Paul Gregory wants to come in straight away. Paul, oh, you're on mute, Paul. Take yourself on mute.
Shader's case, the bankruptcies have been discharged. There is money, £133,000 left in the Insolvency Practitioners Council, which they refuse to give her back and give no reason for it. Absolutely clear.
For last 17 years, they're holding 178,000. And then they said, such and such amount has been given to the Secretary of State. I said, what for? You've got a ruling, the bankruptcy order should have not been made. Why do we have to pay to Secretary of State any fee? Anyhow, they said, your account is in credit for £133,000. We close your account. All right, pay back the money you're holding. And when I attended their office, they called the police. They said that I'm disturbing them. They have to remove me from the premises, and cried on BEIS. I've got a video recording. I'm saying to the police officer, I am here with the appointment. I haven't done anything wrong. Give me another appointment, I'll come another day. But you cannot physically remove me because I haven't done anything wrong. And they did.
Thank you,
This
Shane.
happens in all cases to many, many victims of fraud.
It's atrocious,
The
isn't it?
Insolvency Service is an absolute disgrace.
It certainly comes up time and time again. Pauline, you want to come in now? Please do. Thank you. Off mute first, thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know whether this is particularly helpful to what Sheila was saying. I presume you've tried to talk to your MP, etc., about this and followed that route. And obviously it depends. I think Tom Tugendhat actually, as the security minister, it was mentioned that he's actually responsible for fraud, which is kind of interesting. He actually is very familiar with this problem because he might be worth contacting because he had several constituents involved in the fraud that I was caught up in. And he was very, very good. He was very, very helpful. And the fact that he's now got this job of security minister, you know, which has got apparently responsibility for fraud, I didn't actually know that. We wasted a lot of time trying to talk to various home secretaries and got absolutely nowhere. In fact, most of the time they didn't even answer our letters, which I'm sure you're familiar with too. And I just wanted to throw out to the group. I think Oliver's gone, but I really wanted to ask Oliver in his job at the National Audit Office, and I didn't quite get his title, but I'm hoping I can track him down. He must presumably have the right, or the NAO do, the National Audit Office do, to actually examine how effective the FCA and the National Crime Agency are in, you know, protecting the public adequately from, you know, fraud and economic crime, because clearly it's not working. He said he couldn't investigate, you know, government policy that was currently being discussed or implemented. But these organizations already have statutory duties, or certainly the FCA do. You know, I really wanted to find out what they do on that, because it's something that's occurred to me many times. How do these organizations keep getting away with it, you know, for the last 10 years, you know, that they're not adequately protecting the public? And you know, it must occur to them. They get very large budgets. So I just wanted to throw that out. They get very large budgets. What are they doing with that money?
Yeah. Thank you. I think I'm right in saying, Pauline, that it's generally accepted that the primary responsibility of any nation state is to protect its people. So I absolutely agree with the point you're making. Oliver's a director at the National Audit Office.
Yeah.
Pop me an email, Pauline. I'm sure I'll be able to pop me an email with what you want to say to him, and I'll forward it to and I'll copy you in. Okay, do that. Yeah,
absolutely.
Thanks, Pauline. Would anybody else like to come in who hasn't had a chance to say what they want to say tonight? I know we're all doing a bit of overtime, so to speak, but if your Smiths is worth it, we'll go to Mike McGrath, then we'll go to Nigel Cairns. Mike.
Yeah, I was gonna comment on what Pauline said the other night when I know what we should be calling her is Mrs. Ben, not Pauline Creasy, because you know, the amount of hats that she's had to put on to get compensation for herself. You know, police, regulator, mediator. You know, how many hats does she have to wear? But she made one point where she said she was very close to becoming bankrupt, because she had financial help from friends and families, and the amount of people in the same position as myself, if it weren't for my family and friends, I would have gone bankrupt.
Wow.
And it's crazy, especially hopefully I will get the same result as Pauline. It's taken me 13 years so far, and we're close, but I would like to find out how many people that have got resolution. I mean, I think even Noel Emmons said he was going to top himself.
Yeah.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah. Noel Emmons said he left a message for his family because he was going to commit suicide.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Oh dear, making me think of the end. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Mike. Nigel put his hand up as well. Nigel Cairns.
Yes, I'd just like to repeat a statement that's been made many times before, but not particularly tonight. And that is that the FCA keep on with their mantra that they don't act or get involved in individual cases. There are only individual, you can have collections of individual cases, but all cases effectively are individual. Now, I don't know of any statutory or legal basis on which they're supporting, you know, their line that they've been going with for years, that the FCA will not investigate or get involved with individual cases. They have the statutory objective of, as Pauline was alluding to, of protecting individuals, the statutory objective of adequate consumer protection doesn't specify that it disapplies to individuals. It clearly does. And this is the expectation of Parliament. And, you know, I think we ought to do more about challenging the FCA on, you know, what authority they think applies to this statement. Okay.
Nigel, I have an idea. We'll go to Paul, then to Pauline. We put the hands up. I have an idea, Nigel. Pop me a one paragraph question around that, and we'll send it to a few folks on the Treasury Committee to see if they can park it for when they next have Nikhil Rathi and or the chair, Ashley Alder of the FCA in for a question, because it's a really significant point you make. It really is, Nigel. It deserves an answer. What is the basis for the FCA's position that it doesn't get involved with individual cases? I mean, that's the question. It's a bloody good question. Excuse my language, folks. Sorry. Paul, then Pauline. Mr. Gregory.
There is an offence called contempt of statute. Now, as you say, it's contempt that they have a statutory duty to protect the citizens. The problem lies that even if you could do that, would you get anybody to convict them? That is a problem. It's the going round in circles again. But I think contempt of statute, if somebody could legally could look into that and put that together with, you know, what is your legal basis for doing that, would be helpful. Thank you.
I'd just like to come in there. I don't think there's any lack of powers. And the FCA say that themselves. There's all sorts of, they constantly refer to various tools and methods that they can use to address different problems. The age-old problem is that there's no action and no will.
But that is contempt of statute.
I want to know more about this statute. I want to know more about
what I'm suggesting as we find out about it.
Yeah. This might be a case for Stephen Barker. This could be right up your street, sir, to find out about contempt of statute. It's got Stephen Barker written all over it, that has. Mr. Barker, first of all, your point, and then come back to that one. Thank you.
Well, they are related. I think Nigel makes the question very clear. The FCA choose to interpret legislation as they see fit. It is not the job of a regulator or a public authority or anybody in authority to interpret legislation. The courts interpret legislation. There are recent Supreme Court decisions on this principle. It therefore is unarguable as far as the FCA is concerned. They should apply the plain English that the words of the Act give us. And I'm sure if we were to read a paragraph of the Financial Services and Markets Act, especially Section 382, with the powers granted to the Secretary of State and the FCA to issue or seek the courts to issue a restitution order, we would all agree on the use of the English. There's nothing particularly strained about it. But the FCA don't wish to do that. And they have not done so in the case of bank fraud. And of course, and I think this is what Andy was rather smiling about, I've been seeking the Secretary of State by name. Who is he? Do we know? Does anybody know? You'd think the Treasury would know. After all, they are the government department that report to Parliament every time they wish to introduce a statutory instrument regarding financial services. They are also a person of significant control on the FCA, which is constituted as a company. So you would think they'd know, but the last minister I wrote to and got a reply from some individual. He was speculating, he wasn't saying, but he thinks it could be the Secretary of State for Business and Enterprise. Only could be. Now that would be a sort of answer that you would give if the legislation had come into force yesterday, but it has been in force now for 21 years. You would think that in that time, somebody else might have asked that question and somebody might have been given an answer. The reality is, Nigel, that the FCA is completely out of control as an organisation. It's the fire brigade that doesn't turn up. It's the police authority that doesn't enforce the criminal law. That's the FCA.
Yeah.
So I don't think really we're going to get an answer from the FCA other than a woolly sort of answer. But I think you're right, on the right track about its duty and the actual exercise of the powers that it's got under the Act and its failure to do so.
Yes. Well, I'd like to point out one thing, because Mr. Rathie is on record on one of our symposiums as stating that it is the independence of the FCA that gives him the authority to interpret the legislation. And he didn't expand on that. He just said that that was the end of the matter because they're independent and not accountable. But my view is that they're acting outside of their scope because they don't have the authority to make that decision. And I think that's in accordance with Mr. Gregory's point.
I think Nigel, you've got to look broader than that. This is administrative law. This is well-trodden ground. There's all sorts of pieces of legislation passed where either officials or recognised bodies or authorities or competent authorities are given powers. And at no point in all that legislation does any of that legislation say, tell you what, make it up as you go along. We don't care.
Yeah, but we must challenge it. We have to challenge this.
I agree with you, and indeed, some of us have been working on that and building a case to demonstrate the unwillingness of the FCA to answer the basic question. And ultimately, we may find ourselves in the right forum to expose their duplicity and dishonesty. Now, we submitted, and that's the TTF, submitted a very long, and perhaps too long, but nevertheless a very long and comprehensive letter to the FCA, to the chairman of the board. We discussed it, as you know, in sessions like this. their response to at least my letter, I don't know if anyone else submitted the same sort of template, but it's to pass it to their complaints department. Now, their complaints department is constituted under a sort of subsection of later legislation that sits under the FCA. And it ultimately goes to the Complaints Commissioner. It's a device, though. The FCA are not answering the question. They're putting it into a process. They know full well that that process will support them because they're running that process. So the next step is to appeal, and it'll appeal to the Complaints Commissioner. And the Complaints Commissioner will look at the legislation that governs what he can do or she can do and say, I can't deal with this. But the FCA will say, we went through a process and we dealt with Mr. Barker's complaint, and that's the end of the matter. That's no good to me, and it's no good to the rest of us. What we want is the opportunity to get before an appropriate forum, such as a criminal court, that they have been complicit in defrauding ourselves in a variety of ways by taking it upon themselves. They've acted ultra vires, beyond their powers, and they knew what the effect would be. And my point, or the center of my sort of case here, is that one day I was a retail client, a statutory definition of a retail client. I didn't make that analysis. The bank made that analysis under the same legislation that required them to make that analysis. And they decided I didn't have the skills or the knowledge to enter into a commercial arrangement with them, except as a retail client. And on that basis, I would get certain protections, and the bank would be under certain obligations. And then as we heard in the Swift report, the banks, having been found that in over 90% of those sales, they ignored those obligations, and they were deemed by the regulator to have acted irregularly. These are the words out of the Act. I don't have to make that case. The regulators made that case. So they've behaved irregularly. And at that point, the regulator could apply to the courts for a restitution order under Section 382. They don't do that. They agree to go into some sort of an arrangement with the banks in 2012. And at the same time, they agree with the banks that some retail clients will now be called sophisticated retail clients, for which there is no statutory definition, and they will be excluded. And they knew what the cost of that would be. And Weekly reported to the Treasury Select Committee, the evidence is there. Weekly told the Treasury Select Committee that of the 2/3 of people who were in the scheme, they would receive about 1/3 in value of the total losses. And the 1/3 that were excluded would lose 2/3 of the total value just because they'd been excluded. So we paid for the 1/3 who did get some restitution.
And the Treasury were and the Chancellor were complicit in that decision, if I'm
yes,
not
yes, but they're complicit anyway by virtue of being the person of significant control in the company of. You see, the FCA is a company. It's not a government department. It is a limited liability company by guarantee, but that doesn't change the basic company law position. And the person of significant control is the Treasury, and something like that should have been considered and was considered by the board of the FCA.
Fascinating stuff, gentlemen. Really fascinating.
Sorry.
Don't apologise. It's really, really interesting. Thank you.
Just quick.
Yeah, go for it, Paul, and then we'll start bringing these sessions to a second.
Lord Swift-Neavesey, 1916, House of Lords. The interpretation of a statute is in the ordinary meaning of the words.
Correct.
That's it.
That's it.
Don't have to go anywhere else.
No.
You'd know lawyers, ordinary meaning of the words.
Yes.
Thank you, Paul. It's 20 to 9. Crikey, it's 20 to 9ish. I just want to thank everybody for your your staying power, your resilience, your interest, your engagement, your input, and all those words that come to mind. In so many ways, TTF is kind of about making it up as we go along. There's no format here. There's no formula. There's no template. There's no instruction manual. I'll just carry on going where the energy takes us. And it's very, very clear to me that the energy is taking us in the direction of challenging the regulatory framework because it's failing left, right, and centre. It really is failing left, right, and centre. I briefly mentioned that the Financial Services and Markets Bill has completed its committee stage in the Lords. It's going to be going into the report stage probably after Easter, and we're expecting there to be quite a few battles fought in the Lords over the sort of things we've been discussing today, particularly the lack of accountability of the FCA. I put a note in the chat, I thought it just came to mind. Unaccountable power is dangerous, and that's fundamentally what's wrong with the FCA. It's got a hell of a lot of power, and it's not being held accountable. That surely must change. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We'll bring the long marathon session to a close. We'll definitely be revisiting this topic. I've got a feeling that the next title for our fraud event will be why is the UK still so poor at tackling it? On that comical note, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye. Good night. Good night.